You're listening to Spellbound. Welcome to episode 13 of Spellbound. I'm Julian Smith, and I'm so excited to announce that Spellbound is now a CastBox original. The podcast will still be available anywhere you've listened to it in the past, but I hope you'll give CastBox a shot today and see what's made it the fastest growing and highest rated podcast app of any platform, including both iOS and Android. I'm joined today by Ron Hendel. Welcome, Ron. Thanks for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure.
Ron, you are the professor of Hebrew Bible and Jewish Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. You're also the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Hebrew Bible and the author of Remembering Abraham and Reading Genesis.
Yep.
And this is part 3 in our Bible series called Who Wrote the Bible? I started this series because I want to learn more about this fascinating book, its various interpretations throughout time, and how it came to be what it is today. And I'm excited about diving in with you and hearing what you have to say about it.
Okay, well, you might be happy now.
Well, what's interesting is, we've been studying the Old Testament. We've started with the Old Testament for now, but, we may move on to the New Testament later. But when discussing whether or not the Bible is divinely inspired, it seems the points at which people typically diverge are somewhere around the origin of and definition of morality, as according to the Bible, and then also the Old Testament and its miracles. And so as somebody who is so intimate with these old texts, Ron, I'd like to know how you feel about the Old Testament and its perception of miracles.
First of all, I think you have to make a couple of qualifications. There's things like talking snakes in the Garden of Eden story. Is that sort of what you mean by a miracle?
I'm talking more like parting of the Red Sea, the burning bush, things like that are kind of grandiose and, played major pivotal roles in the story. Yeah,
well, I would say that these are things that, as you say, play a pivotal role in the stories. And so the way that I think is productive to look at them is to ask what they do in the stories, what kind of pivotal role they play. I think to ask whether something really happened or not is a kind of necessary question for us, but I think it in some ways misses part of the point. And I think the point really is more what you said, the role that they play, the pivotal role that they play in the stories. So let's take your example of the parting of the Red Sea. For a biblical scholar, what one wants to note is, first of all, there's different versions of that story. The parting of the Red Sea is actually in the latest of the 3 or 4 versions of that story that we have. And in some ways, the parting is an interpretation of one of the earlier stories. So here's what I would say. Rather than using vocabulary like miracle and did it happen or did it not happen, I'm more comfortable with using the category of cultural memory.
I've heard you talk about this. This is interesting.
Yeah, so this is something that every culture has. What's important is the way that a culture remembers its past. Okay, and that's what makes the past relevant for the present. It's the way that it is remembered. Asking did things happen or did things not happen is interesting and necessary, but it doesn't really get to the role that things play. So, for example, tonight is the first night of Passover. So the parting of the Red Sea and the Exodus story is a very timely thing to talk about. Now, what kind of role does that play? The role that it plays is in this memory of liberation from slavery. Okay? And so to have a story of that liberation from slavery, it has to be a good story to make it memorable. So the parting of the Red Sea in one of the versions of the story certainly makes it memorable. The 10 plagues make the story memorable. The heroism of Moses going up against Pharaoh, saying, "Let my people go," this makes the story memorable. This is what the story is about. The plague of frogs, the plague of turning the Nile River into blood. These are memorable things that make the whole thing work.
So would you say that they're symbolic or something, or that they're...
I wouldn't say they're symbolic. I would say they're dramatic. They're pivotal events in the memory of the people. And the point is to make this image of the past something that informs one's identity in the present. So, for example, in the Passover Seder that Jews will read tonight during this ritual ceremony, it says, everyone here should regard him or herself as if you yourself were liberated from slavery in these great events of the past. And I think that goes to what the story is about. It's about shaping identity, both personal identity and collective identity in the present, by means of these great memories of decisive and dramatic and, yes, miraculous events in the past. So the point is the shaping of identity. And I think the Passover Haggadah really puts a point on that by saying everyone should regard him or herself as if you experienced these things. So there's a presentness to the memory that shapes your outlook, shapes your understanding of the world and of yourself. And that's what's really going on here. The fact that these things are miraculous are what makes the story a great story. So I think that's really the focus, that's the important focus.
So what would you say to somebody who responds to that with something along the lines of the parting of the Red Sea helped Israel escape from Egypt and the plagues helped Israel escape from Egypt? So if you take these miracles and say that they didn't really happen the way that the stories said they did, it's just a way to make it memorable and part of their cultural memory, then how do these stories maintain their significance in a, I mean, like if you take some of it away, isn't it kind of taking away from all of it?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good question. And that also goes to what I would describe as the complexity of cultural memory in an era, that is to say, our era, when things like historical accuracy are important. And let me give an example. I used to teach in a university in Texas, in Dallas, Texas. And 1 year on the anniversary of the Alamo, and remember that the tag for the Alamo is Remember the Alamo. Okay, so this is a very important part of cultural memory in Texas. And a journalist wrote an article saying, well, you know what? You know what they were defending at the Alamo is one of the main things they were doing was fighting against Mexico so that they could keep their slaves. So all these heroes of the Alamo were defending their ability to own black slaves, which Mexico had declared slavery illegal. Now, when this journalist pointed this out, people were outraged. They were saying, how can you say that Davy Crockett and all these guys were just fighting to keep their slaves? Because we all know slavery is wrong. But these guys are our heroes. And so you have a choice at that point. You have to say that historical analysis and historical accuracy is a virtue that negates cultural memory, in which case you shouldn't remember the Alamo. Or you can say that the reporter that pointed this out is wicked, which is the major response that happened at the time. Or you can say that these are two different values, that cultural memory emphasizes certain things, and cultural memory also forgets certain things. The memory of the Alamo had forgotten that they were fighting to a large extent to be able to keep their slaves. And you have to, in some way, balance the claims of cultural memory against the claims of history, even when they conflict with each other. So that's the world we live in. So the Passover tonight, these are great miracles that didn't necessarily happen. And yet there was there was an identity that was formed of ancient Israel where they saw themselves as having been redeemed from Egyptian slavery. And there probably is some historical truth to that, but not the plague of frogs and the plague of lice and the parting of the Red Sea. So we're in a situation where these are two different sets of values that are in conflict, and that creates complexity in our modern condition.
Yeah, it does create complexity, and I've used this example before. It's similar to your example of the Alamo, the whole Thanksgiving story that is told about American tradition when we first got here. We were taught in schools that we sat down with the Native Americans and cooked a turkey and we all got along and shared a meal, but we know that's not really what happened. The problem with believing something like that in that way is that it puts you at odds with everything that you're experiencing. Like, there's so many Americans that probably think that that's how the first Thanksgiving went down, and so they're living in this Native American land completely oblivious to what we did back when we got here.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good example, and this shows some of the dynamics of cultural memory, which is to say that cultural memory has to forget certain things in order for it to function in a positive way. So in a sense, the Thanksgiving scenario that we're taught in schools is a good memory. I mean, it actually teaches us that, people should get along with each other. That Europeans and Indians can get along and help each other and this and that. These are good values. What we forgot, what the cultural memory deliberately forgets, is the cultural and, the cultural genocide and the actual genocide of the Native Americans by these Massachusetts colonists, which happened in the 20 years or so after the Thanksgiving event. But if it remembered that, that's not a value. That's evil. So you don't want to remember that. But then when a Native American speaks up and says, hey, you guys are omitting this stuff that we find really important because you guys, wiped us out, then Thanksgiving becomes complicated. So, for example, in Berkeley, where I teach, Thanksgiving is called Indigenous Peoples Day.
Wow.
So
I love that.
It's like an anti-Thanksgiving. And this is kind of the creation of a new memory, a counter memory that compensates for the flaws in the previous memory. But you end up with a situation that, we would say is good because we're taking cognizance of each other's cultural memory, but it makes it complicated. So we live in a world where, there aren't that many stable cultural memories that don't step on people one way or the other. Think about Thomas Jefferson. He used to be the ultimate hero. And now that we know that he was, having sex with his slave girlfriend, that really complicates his whole persona.
Yeah, what you're describing is kind of this tightrope of a perspective on history where you're forced to, it's very easy to fall on either side of it and say, well, you're throwing everything out, nothing's important, or you're saying everything is to be taken literally and we have to remember everything the history books and our religious texts say verbatim. And you're kind of suggesting this tightrope that's very difficult to walk, where it's like, okay, this is a form of history that was written in a very specific way, and we have to appreciate all of its uniqueness and everything that it's saying on a human level, and we have to take that and we have to remember what actually happened. But we don't want to obsess over the bad parts. We want to try to, obviously make things as good as we can for everybody. That's why we don't. I think that's probably why the history books get rewritten in terms of like the Native Americans and the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving and things like that. But I think it's really challenging for a lot of people to do that, to see history in that way.
It's definitely challenging, but it's the challenge that if you ignore, then you're just an ostrich with your head in the sand. You can ignore the past, and you can also ignore cultural memory. You can ignore the Bible as a part of who we are, but I think that's just as much being an ostrich as saying that everything in the Bible is true.
Well, ostriches are pretty cool birds.
Ostriches are cool birds, but when they stick their head in the sand, they can't see anything. Now, I don't even know if they do stick their head in the sand. Again, that's an item of cultural memory, which I don't know if that's historically accurate or not.
Yeah, you're becoming quite a hypocrite now, Ron.
No, I'm saying cultural memory has its own values.
I'm messing with you.
And whether it's historically true or not, and I think this is the important point, whether it's historically true or not doesn't negate the values that cultural memories affirm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up in a house where these miracles they happened the way that the Bible said that they happened. And if you believed anything differently, it was heresy, and nothing else in the Bible made sense without them. And I've kind of had to do a lot of learning on my own as I left my parents' house and became an adult and had to make my own picture of the world to make sense of, because I got out on my own and things weren't making sense. I was like, none of this really makes sense the way that I was taught to believe it. And I find myself constantly at odds with things. So I've done a lot of I guess you could say, soul searching over the last several years. And it is really amazing how hard of a time certain people have with seeing history in this way that you're describing.
It's a challenge, and it's a challenge at a lot of levels. One day when both of my sons came home from school, they were probably in first and second grade or something, and they had made pilgrim hats. It was Thanksgiving. And I told them that not only was Thanksgiving complicit in this genocide of Native American cultures, but if the Massachusetts Pilgrims saw these two little Jewish boys wearing pilgrim hats, they'd probably burn them at the stake. They were very intolerant people.
Right.
And my oldest son said something brilliant. He said, "Dad, that's not what our teacher told us. I don't believe you."
Wow.
And so that showed me that criticizing cultural memory, which does have these positive virtues that it inculcates, getting along with people and being proud of who you are and, respecting different cultures and such. This is taught by our authoritative teachers, the authoritative keepers of memory. And if you criticize that, the natural response is to say, you're just wrong. And my kid was saying that to me. Now, he doesn't feel that anymore, but it was just adorable that he said that.
Dad, you're not very smart. You're not as smart as people think you are.
So this is part of the difficulty that people have with hearing these sorts of, criticisms or qualifications or historical analysis. It's resisted simply because cultural history has its own kind of protective shell on it. And this, again, is the problem. Once you stand outside that shell, it creates a kind of disorientation.
Yeah, and the Bible's interesting because it starts out with all these miracles. And I know you're saying you're trying to abstain from using the word miracles, but for lack of a better term, I'll just continue to use that word. Miracles are all over the beginning of the Old Testament, and then the further down towards the end of it you go, there's less and less miraculous things happening. Not that it's totally devoid of things like that. I mean, there's like the story of in Ezekiel, like the valley of dry bones coming to life. But even still, miracles are all over the beginning of the Bible, and then throughout the Old Testament, they kind of start to dwindle away. And then if you're a Christian, the New Testament is full of its own miracles that kind of have this resurgent, miraculous nature. There's this miraculous nature about the New Testament when Jesus comes on the scene. And I think maybe for some people in Western culture, since Christianity is so huge, maybe the threat of seeing the Old Testament miracles as allegory, maybe that threatens the validity of the New Testament in a certain way or something like that.
Well, it certainly does in modern culture, but I wouldn't say that they're allegories, that the stories of Genesis, for example, are allegories. These are what people believed the past to have been. So they weren't believed in ancient Israel to be allegories. This is cultural memories of the past, and there's this idea that in the past, these great miracles happened. Now, notice that also implies that in the current world, those kinds of miracles don't happen or don't happen as commonly. So there's a kind of pastness to these miracles, that they're primarily limited to the kind of formative era when the shape of the present world was coming into being, was being shaped. And this is why in Christianity, the period of Jesus and the apostles is another period of this kind of resurgence of miracles, because this is a reshaping of the world.
Right.
But it's only in these shaping times that these miracles happen. So in most cultures, the basic idea is that now, in the present world, these things don't happen because you look around you and you don't see them happening. So the pastness of these miracles is part of what defines what they are, that they're things that don't happen now.
So let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's say, let's see this from the perspective of somebody who believes that the miracles in the Old Testament, the parting of the Red Sea, the burning bush, the plagues in Egypt, this is how I'm supposed to read this book, literally. Does the Bible attempt to give any explanation as to why the miracles could have been so common in ancient times only to disappear completely today?
Well, there's no explicit reason. I think it's simply that when you look around today, you don't see them. So there's a kind of experiential quality that these are these great events and also these great people belong to the era of the ancestors, the era of the distant past. Well, let me put it more generally, that in many traditional cultures, the past, and specifically the remote past, is imbued with a kind of energy and vitality and greatness that is missing in the present. The veneration of the past really only changed during the period of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, where we started thinking that, hey, we're the most advanced people. Prior to that, it was the ancients who were always more advanced, more powerful, more wise, and more heroic than the present age. So think, for example, of in Greek tradition, that there's this sequence of eras. First, there's the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age, and we just live in a crappy age that's after all of these.
The plastic age.
Yeah, we're in the plastic age, exactly. So there's a downhill motion of history. And so you don't expect great things to happen now because we don't live in one of these great eras of the past. So I think that would be the native construct of why these things happened way back then and don't happen now, because we live in a diminished age, they would say.
I've heard a lot of people talk about the silence of God in this kind of, at this point in the conversation. A lot of people who want to believe that the miracles in the Old Testament happened exactly the way that the book says it did. They say, well, God has become silent. But I've never really understood where the Old Testament justifies that kind of an approach.
Well, I think it's just implicit in that, the great ones were, and the great events were in the time of, the patriarchs and Moses, and these things don't happen anymore because we're not living in these great heroic ages. So it's not explicit anywhere why this stuff doesn't happen anymore. But it's implicit in this trajectory of the past, that these were the great events. These were they call them the righteous deeds of Yahweh, the Tzidkot Yahweh, the great deeds of God were the great deeds of the past. Now, in some texts in the Bible, it looks forward to the future as a time when these great events will recur. There will be a new creation, a new Exodus in the future, a time of universal redemption. And so in a sense, that's just flipping this temporal orientation. Great events happen in the distant past, but they're also going to happen in the near future and will change the world into a great era again. And that now is in a time between these great eras. So this is something that is explicit in the Bible, that there will be this new redemptive activity that's just over the horizon.
Okay, so that rationale is actually not as far-fetched as I thought it was. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that now is a time when nothing really is going on, you find that in a lot of texts, particularly the ones that are looking forward to redemptive events in the future. They're saying now is a time of suffering, of a time when God is hiding his face. But built into that is the idea that the time will come when God will expose his face once again and, set things aright. The wicked will be punished and the righteous will be redeemed.
Yeah, that just sounds incredibly frustrating.
Well, but it's a way of orienting yourself to reality, because now is a time, always, I would say, when, the wicked prosper and then the righteous suffer and, little babies die of diseases and there's war and suffering. That's always going to be characterizing the now. And so if you want to compensate for that by some sunnier vision, It's either going to be in the past or it's going to be in the future. Because right now, and certainly in the historical books of the Bible, and let's say in Jewish history generally, now often sucks.
You look at the miracles in the Old Testament through this lens of cultural memory, and you just kind of let it stay in that box.
Well, I think it's a box that allows you to understand various aspects of these phenomena, including the way that these miracles are important to people, and that people are resistant to having them questioned by historical types of analysis. And so I think looking at them as cultural memory helps us understand why it's a fraught issue for both believing Jews and Christians and for unbelieving Jews and Christians and Muslims too. That these are parts of a discourse that's very uncomfortable for both sides, because cultural memory is such an important thing in our lives, and so it has a kind of toxic quality to mess with.
Well, it's also kind of a central, very inclusive. It's the only perspective on it that I can think of that's inclusive of everything. It says the Old Testament is not worthless. It's not outdated.
Right.
But it also challenges and includes both sides, and it's the only argument I can think of that does that.
And that's why I like it. And as you say, it is a category that entails respect for these traditions. It's something that shows that these are important things for all cultures, and yet we are not let off the hook to critique them, where they either conflict with what we know about history, or where they conflict with moral values of the present. So one of the important things about cultural memory is that it always engenders counter memories, revisions of the memory.
Right.
And so something like, Indigenous Peoples Day is a counter memory to the memory of Thanksgiving. And I think this is what always happens. And I think when you look in the Bible carefully, you see that there are memories and counter memories. There are arguments over the past within the different biblical books. So I think it's a category that has a lot of explanatory power.
So let's move on to morality, because that was the second thing that I've noticed people tend to diverge on when they're discussing the Bible and its historicity and authenticity, yada, yada, yada. What is the problem with morality being both invented and defined by the Bible?
Morality is being invented in the Bible? I'm not sure the Bible would agree with that. Let me go back to the example of Cain and Abel. It's pretty clear that it's immoral for Cain to murder his brother, but there was no explicit command prior to that says thou shalt not murder. That doesn't come until the era of Moses with the revelation at Mount Sinai.
Right.
But it's clear in the story. I don't think you can read the story and say that Cain's not a bad guy because he murdered his brother. So in the biblical stories themselves, there's an implicit understanding that morality is a kind of natural thing, okay, that we all have a natural intuition of. And moreover, there are stories that indicate that God acknowledges that there is this kind of natural morality that he's willing to adjust his behavior to. There's a wonderful story, the Sodom and Gomorrah story, where God says, shall I not tell Abraham what I'm about to do? Because Abraham, my intention is that he will teach his children the way of righteousness. So God says, I'm going to kill all the people in Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, well, what if there are some innocent people there? Shouldn't you save them and moreover forgive the whole place for the sake of the innocent? And he says, shall not the God of justice act justly? And God says, well, good point. Okay.
Hadn't thought about that, Abraham.
Well, there's a certain amount of kind of testing that God, I think that God is sort of testing Abraham to see if Abraham will stand up for moral principles when God says he's just going to destroy this whole city. And Abraham does. And God says, okay, that you've made a good moral point, and I will adjust my behavior accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I'm getting at with the idea of morality being invented and defined by the Bible is you have a lot of people that I think just kind of without any specific motivation, they just think of the Bible in that way, that it's the origin and basis of all good and evil, and that nothing before it could ever come close to the Bible's definition of what good and evil is. And yet there is plenty of moral dilemmas in the Old Testament before Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments and all that stuff. And you're right. So what are some more problems with this perspective?
Well, I think in one sense, there's a lot of powerful moral insights in the Bible. The Ten Commandments would certainly be on that list. Things like thou shalt not murder and steal and bear false witness and, desire your neighbor's stuff. So there's a lot of very powerful moral discourses in the Bible. But I think it's important to note that the Bible acknowledges that there are moral principles that are just sort of built into existence, like this issue of Cain and Abel, and like this issue of Abraham arguing with God on moral principles. So it's I think false to say that the Bible presents itself as inventing morality. The Bible is articulating a moral order that it perceives in the cosmos, and certainly God's laws build on that. But I think it's oversimplifying to say that the Bible invents morality. And I think it's also important to say that there are things in the Bible that are immoral. The issue of slavery would be one of those. And I think most of us would agree that the subjugation of women is immoral. Morality begets further moral discourse, and we shouldn't be afraid. In fact, we're not afraid of arguing things like the affirmation of slavery in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is wrong.
And what about prior to any biblical writings? What are some? I mean, there was thousands of years of religion before Judaism came on the scene, and I think maybe a lot of people don't think about that and those implications, that there was all of this stuff beforehand that was telling people the things they should do and the things they shouldn't do. And so what are some examples of that?
Famous example, I think, would be the Code of Hammurabi, which lists all sorts of civil laws protecting the widow and the orphan and things of that nature, penalties for murder and theft and things like that. So there were these law codes in the ancient world that the law codes in the Bible, belong to the same genre. So it's a very long tradition. In Egyptian religion as well, when you go into the underworld, they weigh your heart, your moral deeds against a feather. And if you've committed more immoralities on this weight, on this balance, than a feather, then a huge demon eats you.
Sounds kind of scary.
It's kind of scary. It's supposed to be kind of scary. So there's definitely a strong moral code in the civilizations of the ancient world as far back as we have writing. And so that means as far back as we can tell.
Why do you think some people are so opposed to the idea of morality as an evolutionary construct?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by evolutionary construct. Are you saying that primates and fish are moral too?
No, I'm saying that humans know the difference between right and wrong in a way that animals do not. I don't think anybody denies that that's what sets humans apart in a special way. But
well, I think that what you're saying is something that the Bible would share. If you think of the Garden of Eden story, one of the things that make people different from the animals is that Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Right, but there's two things you can do with that. You can say that humans know right and wrong because we ate from this tree and we weren't supposed to have done that, and now we are cursed with knowing the difference between good and evil and having to, choose which side we're going to align ourselves with for the rest of our lives. Or you can say that, struggle is growth, and that's how we evolved to come to these agreements about what is right and wrong and how people should and shouldn't behave in order to be able to survive in civilization.
Well, let me say that in the Garden of Eden story, it's not the knowledge of good and evil that's a curse.
Right. I didn't mean to imply that in and itself was a curse, but that there were these all of these challenges that came along with it.
Yes. Well, there are curses that come in the train of that, but that in and of itself is described, I think, in the Garden of Eden story as an ascent, because it makes people like gods. So this is part of the problem: the human consciousness of morality, and it's also consciousness of mortality. When they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, God says, henceforth you have to work hard until you return from to the earth from which you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. This is also consciousness of mortality, which is also something that distinguishes humans from animals, I think, according to the story. So We're aware of our limited lifetime, and this is also a burden, a curse.
What I'm getting at is that you either believe, there's all kinds of things anybody can believe, but in relation to the Old Testament, if you subscribe to it on any level, you either believe that Earth was created in 7 days by God, and that we know good and evil because we ate fruit that God told us not to eat, and we took matters into our own hands and we sinned, and that's how we came to understand morality. Or you believe that whether God was involved or not, the earth came into existence through the Big Bang or whatever it was, and we evolved very slowly into humans, and it's only just in the last couple 100,000 years where we've started to realize that our actions have weight to them, and it's only because we've really struggled with it and we've really wrestled with it and we've become really experienced with it that we've come up with all of these rules for how people should and should not behave.
I think that this gets us back to the issue of cultural memory versus other modes of knowledge like science and history. For the Bible, and for Genesis in particular, these things were written in an era where these other modes of knowledge didn't exist. And so these were not problematic. These problems are very, very much modern problems. So I would say, yeah, when scientists tell us something, they know what they're talking about. When the Bible tells us something, it doesn't have a scientific methodology when it's doing so. But I would say that it's also articulating the complexities of things like morality and the human condition in a way that is often very profound.
Right. Not that it's not important, not that it's useless, not that it's even inaccurate or unhistorical in every sense.
But it shouldn't be confused with the results of modern science and history.
Right. You're talking about simply the way it was intended to be read.
Yes. And I'm saying that, this kind of conflict, again, is part of the phenomenon of modernity, where we have these other aspects of knowledge that are, clearly correct. And it creates tension on the cultural memories that are put forward in the Bible.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
So there's no way around that. If you have a believer's view that the Bible is historically accurate, then you're going to have a big problem with modern science.
Yeah, I think that's why you see so many people that do have a problem with modern science, and they're terrified of all the discoveries that it's making, and they're in for even huger, ruder awakenings over the next 50 years as we start to uncover some really crazy stuff.
Yeah, well, I think we've already uncovered some really crazy stuff, and it's hard for people to negotiate how to deal with these different sources of knowledge, and how to deal with the conflicts between science and cultural memory. And so there's no easy answer.
I want to close with two last questions that are not total. They're still on topic of Old Testament, but it's a little further removed from morality and miracles. What exactly are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what do they prove?
The Dead Sea Scrolls are a bunch of texts, scrolls, papyrus scrolls, or leather scrolls. They were hidden away in some caves in the Dead Sea region. Some of these caves probably served as libraries or archives for a community that lived there who we call the Essenes. This was a Jewish sect that had strong apocalyptic expectations that thrived in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. And they went out to the desert, to the area of the Dead Sea, to await the coming of this new eschaton, this new universal redemption that they saw, that they expected to happen any day now. So they were in some ways the first actual apocalyptic community. Doomsday preppers. They were doomsday preppers, and they were the very first ones. That's what's really interesting. And the other more important early apocalyptic community was the early Christians. And the early Christians, they overlapped with these Essenes, but the Essenes were earlier. And so one of the really interesting things about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they shed a lot of light on what it's like to be a member of an apocalyptic community at precisely the same time that the early Christian community is getting started up and crystallizing just up the road. So it gives us tremendous insights into the kinds of thinking, the kinds of expectations, the kinds of beliefs, the kind of religious practices that were going on in different Jewish groups of the period, including the early Christians, which was one of many Jewish groups during that period. So it sheds tremendous light on this hugely important period of Western history and Western religion. It seems like a lot of people hang their hat, especially really conservative people, hang their hat on the Dead Sea Scrolls in debating, the historicity of the Old Testament and whether or not the prophecies were valid and yada, yada, yada. This seems like kind of a misinterpretation of what these scrolls are from this perspective. Yeah, I'm not sure who does that. So I'm not really, I can't really characterize who's doing that or the many ways in which they're wrong. It shows us this vital religious community whose beliefs are, very similar to early Christians and other doomsday preppers. Yeah, but also, they're also at the same time, they're very involved in the interpretation of laws, purity laws, and so forth, festival laws, which is like the early rabbis, too. So they really give us a ton of insight into this very formative period of rabbinic Judaism and of Christianity. And then lastly, I want you to shut me down on this, because this was one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, but in email, you have already shut me down. And since you haven't shut me down, you shut this particular point down in an email that I sent you a couple weeks ago. But since we've kind of been discussing this potential idea in earlier episodes, I think it'd just be valuable for the listeners to hear your take on the idea that the early Old Testament being inspired by the agricultural revolution. Well, the agricultural revolution happened around 7000 BC, and the Old Testament was written, 6,000 or 7,000 years later than that. So I don't see any connection. The one thing that I think you're talking about is that in the Garden of Eden story, you do have the invention of agriculture. Right. As one of the curses. And you have a tree that you're not supposed to eat from. And so from a hunter-gatherer perspective, that would be a tree that is not very good to eat from because, Okay. What's interesting to me is it's not that hard to imagine that in a divergence from hunter-gatherer culture into new civilizational life, it would have been pretty polarizing, and a lot of families would have been uprooted, and a lot of people probably wouldn't have liked it. And so there is several things that I know the timing doesn't make sense, but the
it's interesting to me also in relation to like Cain and Abel. Cain is a farmer and Abel is a herder, a shepherd. And, there's that antipathy there that's so common. There's just a bunch of stuff. I'm not going to go into all the things that overlap. This is actually not my idea. It's an idea from a book by Daniel Quinn called Ishmael, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
No, I'm not. It's just not a very good idea because the timing is so far apart. And when you look at the Garden of Eden story, they're starting out in paradise. They're not hunters and gatherers. There's no hunting involved. And they're gathering, but it's a really easy job. They're living in paradise. So there's an innocence, a kind of ideal utopian quality. Whereas in actual hunter-gatherer existence, there's lots of times of starvation. It's not an ideal kind of existence, which is why when people figured out how to raise crops, they did. It just makes for a more stable and plentiful mode of existence. So
right.
I don't think the emotional coloring of the Garden of Eden can be mapped onto a memory of hunter-gatherer existence.
Well, I think in this idea, the garden is supposed to represent a time when people lived off the land and how much simpler that was. And then once we started growing things and settling specific areas instead of just exhausting all the resources in one area for a couple weeks and then packing up everything and moving again, we were finally able to settle these places where we could just grow whatever we want. And I think that's kind of what the idea suggests. Not that it was obviously hunter-gatherer lifestyle. People would have been dying and starving, and that's what made the agricultural revolution so huge and prosperous. And we're still going off of that idea today because it's such a great idea. I'm not saying that we should go back to hunter-gatherer lifestyle by any means, but I think that the idea is suggesting that the garden was the way things used to be.
Well, it is. It is, but the garden is paradise. It's the ideal utopia that we no longer have access to. Let me put this another way. In the Garden of Eden, people were naked, and yet they weren't ashamed to be seen in public naked. They were like animals. They just ate from the bounty of the fruit trees and stuff. It was an age of innocence. When the snake talks to Eve and she has this desire to eat the forbidden fruit, they gain this knowledge of good and evil, and they see that they're naked, and their response is to make clothes for themselves. They become embarrassed about being naked in public. There's a degree of knowledge of not just morality, but also of sexuality, and they cover their nakedness. I would say that part of the pastness of the Garden of Eden is in a sense a memory of childhood, a time of innocence, a time when you didn't have to work for your food, a time when you didn't know anything about sexuality. You could walk around naked and not be embarrassed. There's a sense in which the transition that Adam and Eve undertake is really a kind of adolescence, a discovery of knowledge, of sexuality, of self-awareness, of limitations, and then a transition to being an adult where you have to work and you have to bear children and you have to be in this patriarchal structure that you didn't have when you were a kid. So I think the longing for the past paradise is not a longing for a hunter-gatherer society. It's a longing for the innocence of youth.
It's an interesting way to look at it. Well, Ron, thanks so much for being with us today and for sharing your insights on this extraordinary book with us. It's so awesome to hear your thoughts. And I hope we can do it again sometime.
Okay, my pleasure. This was fun.
What do you think about miracles and morality? Where do you think these ideas come from? Do you think we make these things up, or do you think they're given to us through evolution or nature? Or do you think they come from some higher power? I'm interested in hearing all responses to this question. I'm interested in all forms of discussion. This is not a debate, not a beating over the head of any kind. And I hope that you guys will treat each other in the same spirit as you explore the discussion in the comments. If you're watching on YouTube, that's a great place to involve yourself with the comments of the other listeners. Or if you have something longer you want to send to me, you can drop me a line, hello@spellboundshow.com. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. That way your phone will always stay up to date. I'm Julian Smith. This has been Spellbound. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am, and I can't wait for next Monday. See you guys then.